Hello everyone, I am Dr. Ramesh Gumasa, Assistant Professor in the Department of Civil Engineering at SR University, Warangal. So today we'll discuss about biodiversity hotspots and the major threats which are affecting on biodiversity across the world. Right. So in this previous lecture, we understand the meaning of biodiversity and levels in the biodiversity followed by the values of biodiversity. So today we will move deeper into areas like biodiversity hotspots and we'll also study how human activities which are causing biodiversity loss. So from these slides, you can see that biodiversity is unevenly distributed across the earth, right? Biodiversity is not equally distributed everywhere on the earth. So some regions which contain exceptionally high number of plants and animals, while other areas which is less. So which is depends upon the region and climatic conditions. So with very high species, uh, regions with very high species richness, which is called biodiversity hotspots. Right? In a simple terms, which is having high species richness, which is called biodiversity hotspots. So these regions are ecologically very important. Right? Why these regions are ecologically important? Because they contain many rare and endemic species. Okay, this region is very important because this region contains many rare and endemic species. However, these hotspots are under severe threat. Why? These hotspots are under severe threat. Why? Because these are the due to human activities like human activities, deforestation, mining, urbanization, and pollution. Right. So these are the main threats to the biodiversity. So the important point is that biodiversity hotspots, which represents areas where conservation efforts are most urgently required, right? So biodiversity which is unevenly distributed across the earth. So some regions which is having high species richness and some regions having low species richness. So these regions are called biodiversity hotspots. So these hotspots are vulnerable because of these human activities like deforestation, mining, and urbanization, and some are related to the pollution. Okay. So conservation of these regions, which are essential for ecological sustainability, right? For proper ecosystem functioning. So biodiversity hotspots, so which is a region that contains very rich or very high biodiversity, large number of endemic species, and high level of environmental threat, right? So which is having higher number of species diversity, but so these hotspots are generally subjected to the higher number of threats because of the human activities. So this concept was introduced by Norman Mayer in the year of 1988. Okay, generally the biodiversity hotspots. So this concept is introduced by the Norman Myers in the year of 1988. So the purpose behind this idea, which is to identify the areas where conservation efforts should be prioritized. Okay, so the conservation efforts are need to incorporate in these specific areas. Okay, so this is the main importance of biodiversity hotspots. So these are the priority region for biodiversity conservation. Okay, so which are supports the rare and endangered species. Okay, it supports the rare and endangered species. So you can see from this figure, global biodiversity in terms of wildlife, conservation status of species, habitats, and species threats. Okay, so and you can also see from the bottom the classification of species by the taxonomy, like in terms of animal, plant, fungi, etc. Right. So these hotspots are extremely important because many species found there do not exist anywhere else. Okay, so many species which are available here, which is not available some other places, right? So if these habitats are destroyed, so those species may become permanently extincted. Okay, so if these habitats are destroyed, those species may become permanently extinct. Okay, so that's why biodiversity hotspots and conservation of biodiversity hotspots are important. And coming to the criteria for the biodiversity hotspots, so to qualify as a biodiversity hotspots, a region must satisfy two conditions. So any region, it should be satisfy two conditions. So first one is criterion 1. So it must contain at least 1500 endemic vascular plant species. Okay. So the region must contain at least of 1500 endemic vascular plant species. And second criteria, which is the region must be at least the region must have lost at least 70% of its natural vegetation. Okay, the region must have lost its at least 70% of its original vegetation, original natural vegetation. So the meaning is biodiversity hotspots are not only biological rich, right, but also highly threatened. Okay, biodiversity hotspots are not only biological rich, but which is also highly threatened. So the key idea is higher biodiversity plus higher threat equals. Okay, higher biodiversity plus higher threats. So which is equals to the biodiversity hotspots. Okay, higher biodiversity plus higher threat, which is equals to the biodiversity hotspots. Okay, so in this you can remember the criteria like criteria 1 and criteria 2, which are required for qualifying the biodiversity hotspots. So which contain at least of 1500 endemic vascular plant species, and it must have 70% of original natural vegetation. And coming to the global biodiversity hotspots. So currently there are 36 recognized biodiversity hotspots in the world. Okay, there are 36 recognized biodiversity hotspots in the world. Although these hotspots occupy only 2%, 4%, 2.4% of its land area. Okay, only 2.4 percentage, 2.4% of it which is occupied. Okay, these hotspots which occupied around 2.4% of earth area. So more than 50% of endemic plant species and nearly 43% of bird, mammal, reptile and amphibian species, okay, which is also supports, okay, which supports more than 50% of endemic plant species as well as 43% of birds, mammals, reptile and other amphibian species. Okay, so you can see some of the examples are tropical Andes, Madagascar, Indo-Burma and Western Ghats. So these clearly show that biodiversity is highly concentrated in certain regions. Okay, and you can see the figure biodiversity hotspots of India. So India contains four major biodiversity hotspots. So first one is Himalaya and the second one is Indo-Burma region. So you can see Himalayas where rich alpine biodiversity. So the biodiversity is in rich alpine and which is having high endemic plant diversity, right? So coming to the Indo-Burma region, so which is nothing but northeastern India, so which is having richer in bird and amphibian diversity, right? So Himalayas, which is related to the alpine biodiversity, and Indo-Burma region, which is having rich in terms of bird and amphibia diversity. And the third one is related to the Western Ghats, so which is having higher amount of endemic flora and fauna diversity, and which is one of the world richest biodiversity region. Okay, Western Ghats are one of the world richest biodiversity region, and Sundaland, so which is like Nicobar Islands. Okay, so the last one is Sundaland, so which includes Nicobar Islands. So these hotspots are extremely important for India's ecological balance, right? Like as we know, India is the one of the world's mega diverse countries, and which contains four major biodiversity hotspots. So first one is Himalayas, which supports alpine ecosystem and endemic plants, and the second one is Indo-Burma region, which are mainly covering northeastern regions, so which are rich in birds and amphibians, and the third one is Western Ghats, so which are having highest and richest biodiversity regions in the world, right? And last one is Sundaland, so which includes Nicobar Islands, and these hotspots are important for ecological balance. Okay, so Ghats hotspot, you can see from this figure. So the Western Ghats extend along the western coast of India, right? So this region is recognized as a UNESCO World, right? This region is recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, UNESCO World Heritage Site, because its ecological importance. Because of its ecological importance, UNESCO World Heritage Site, which is recognized. So it is rich in amphibians, reptiles, and flowering plants. Okay, so Western Ghats hotspots, which are rich in amphibians, reptiles, and flowering plants. Okay, so based on this richness, UNESCO, which is given as uh, recognized as UNESCO World Heritage Site because of this ecological importance. Okay, so the Western Ghats also plays an important role in the river formation. Okay, it is important role in the river formation, and which is also support for climatic regulation. Okay, several major Indian rivers which is originated from this region, like in the Western Ghats. Okay, several major Indian rivers which are starting from this region. So coming to the threats, despite of its ecological importance, the Western Ghats which faces several threats. Like the major threats you can see, first one is deforestation and mining, followed by the urbanization and related to the hydroelectric projects. Okay, these are major threats to the Western Ghats hotspots. And the importance, you can see the major, which is the major source of rivers, because most of the rivers originated from the Western Ghats, and which are supports for the climatic regulations, right? So so if we control these kind of activities, so that we can also controlling the biodiversity failure, right? So these activities destroy the uh, natural habitats and fragment the ecosystem. So as habitats become fragmented, species population will be decreased and the ecology will be misbalanced, or the ecology balance is disturbed, right? And the next one is Himalayan biodiversity. So which is one of the youngest mountain systems, right? The Himalayan hotspot, which is one of the youngest mountain system in the world. It contains diverse ecosystems like forest, alpine meadows, glaciers, etc. So important species in the Himalayan biodiversity hotspots are snow leopard, red panda, Himalayan monal. Okay. So because of this variation in the altitude and the climate, the Himalayas supports very high biodiversity. Okay, because of this richness, Himalaya supports high biodiversity. Coming to the threats to the Himalayan biodiversity hotspots are, first one is climate change and landslides, followed by the deforestation and related to the tourism pressure. Okay, the Himalayan region, which is highly sensitive to environmental disturbance, right? So the major threats which are related to the climatic change, landslides, deforestation and tourism pressure. So climate change, which is especially dangerous because rising of temperature which affect glaciers and species habitats. So many species are forced to migrate to higher altitude. So where survival becomes difficult, right? Because of the climatic change, which is affecting on the temperature, which is affecting on the glaciers and species available in the Himalayan biodiversity. So for that region, many of the species which are forced to migrate from this place to other altitude. So the survival becomes difficult. And the importance of biodiversity hotspots. So biodiversity hotspots are important. You can see the several reasons. So first one is to protect the endemic species and maintain ecological balance, to maintaining the ecological balance, followed by the regulate the climate and water cycles, and which supports the agriculture and livelihoods, and which preserves genetic resources, okay, and which is important for scientific research and as well as medicines. Okay, so these are the important points of biodiversity hotspots. And the key point you can see, loss of hotspots which are irreversible biodiversity loss. Okay, this is key point. So next, threats to the biodiversity. So biodiversity today faces serious threats, which are mainly due to human activities. Right, in the previous slides we discussed it. So the major threats, which includes habitat loss, deforestation, urbanization, pollution, climate change, poaching of wildlife, overexploitation, invasive species. Right. So these are the major threats to the biodiversity. So human activities, which are the primary threat to the biodiversity. So now we are going to further slides. We can discuss about habitat loss. So what is habitat loss? So habitat loss means destruction or fragmentation of natural habitats. So this is considered the greatest threat to the biodiversity, right? So the major cause which are due to deforestation, agriculture, expansion, urban development, mining and industries. So these are the primary causes for habitat loss. And what are the effects? So from the slides, you can see the important effects which are species displacement, population decline, and extinction risk increases. Right. So these are the most effect of habitat loss. Okay, most serious threats to the biodiversity. Right. When habitats are destroyed, species losses their food, shelter, and breeding, etc. Right. As a result, population will be decreased and the risk will be increased. So next one is related to the deforestation. So deforestation, which refers to large scale removal of forest. So the major causes are timber extraction, agriculture, and infrastructure projects. Right. So the environmental impacts, which are loss of wildlife habitat and soil erosion, climatic imbalance followed by the reduced rainfall. Okay, so these are environmental impacts because of the deforestation. So you can see some of the examples like Amazon rainforest destruction. Okay, this is the real life example for the deforestation. So the Amazon rainforest, which is one of the most well-known example of large-scale deforestation. So next one is related to the urbanization and industrialization. So rapid urban growth, which converts forest into cities and industries, right? So this leads to conversion of forest into cities and industries, which is effect on habitat fragmentation, air and water pollution, and reduction in green cover, like in terms of plants, and disturbance to the wildlife migration. Okay, because of conversion of forest into cities and industries, these are the primary effects, like which disturbance to the wildlife migration. Okay, so the examples are the expansion of metropolitan cities. So expansion of metropolitan cities, which is increasing ecological pressure, right? Which is increasing the ecological pressure globally. So next one is related to the pollution and biodiversity loss. So there are different types of pollution which are affecting on the biodiversity. So first one is air pollution, followed by the water pollution, soil pollution, and plastic pollution. Okay, so these pollutants may directly kill the organisms or weaken the organisms with the time. Okay, generally you can see plastic, this plastic waste, especially which affect the marine ecosystem, right? Next, pollution. So pollution can also enter to the food chain through the this bioaccumulation process and biomagnification process. Okay, food also will be polluted. So leads to adverse effect in terms of toxicity in the organisms and death of aquatic species, reduction in the soil fertility, followed by the bioaccumulation in the food chains. Okay, so which are the primary effects related to the pollution and biodiversity loss? Climate change. Climate change is one of the biggest modern environmental challenge, right? Which is biggest modern environmental challenge. So the major causes for the climate change because of global warming and greenhouse gas emissions, right? First one is greenhouse gas emissions, so which is effect on global warming. Okay, so the primary effects on biodiversity are habitat shift, species migration, coral bleaching, glacier melting, and extinction of sensitive species. Okay, so these are main effect of effect on biodiversity because of the climate change. So sensitive species which may become extinct if they cannot adapt quickly through the environment. Right. Example, you can see polar species which are losing the habitat because of the climatic change. So next one is poaching of wildlife. So poaching means illegal hunting or capturing wildlife animals. So the major reasons which are includes like commercial trade, animal skin, and for traditional medicine purposes, and ivory and horns. So these are the primary reasons for poaching of wildlife. And you can also see some of the adverse effects because of rapid population decline, extinction of risk, and ecological imbalance. So these are the effects because of the poaching of wildlife. Okay, so some of the examples like you can see tigers, rhinos, and elephants. So the poaching will be reduces population size rapidly, and which disrupt the ecosystem balance. Invasive species, so which is a non-native species which are introduced into the ecosystem. Okay, invasive species are non-native species which are introduced in the ecosystem. So these species compete with the native organisms, right? So which can spread the diseases, and which disturb the ecosystem balance, right? You can see some of the examples like water hyacinth, and lantana, and paranthemum. Okay, these are the some of the examples like water hyacinth and lantana, etc., right? So which results reduction in native biodiversity because they spread whatever the diseases rapidly. Because of this, the reduction in the native biodiversity. Okay, so next one is endangered species. So endangered species are organisms which are facing very high risk of extinction. So the main causes which includes habitat destruction, hunting, pollution, followed by the climate change. So the examples like Bengal tiger, Asiatic lion, Great Indian bustard. Okay, these are the some of the examples related to the endangered species. So which are required for conservation of environment, right? So conservation needed immediately for endangered species. Okay, because these species require immediate conservation measures. Otherwise, there is risk of extinction. There is a high risk of extinction. Next one is endemic species. So these are found only in specific geographic regions. So they have restricted distribution, and which are highly sensitive to habitat changes. Okay, so examples in India, Nilagiri tahir, lion-tailed macaw, and purple fry. Okay, these are the some of the examples in India for endemic species. So the examples you can see from this figure, and its importance. So which are unique biological heritage. Okay, so these are for unique biological heritage. So if endemic species disappear, they become globally extinct. Okay, this is the importance of endemic species in terms of biodiversity. So next one related to the red data book. The red data book contains information about threatened species. Okay, this is the red data book which contains information about threatened species. So it is associated with the International Union for Conservation of Nature, right? IUCN, International Union for Conservation of Nature. So species are categorized as extinction, endangered and vulnerable. Okay, and rare and least concern. So the species are categorized based on these following conditions, and the purpose is to monitor and conservation planning. Okay, for monitoring and conservation planning. So the red data book, which are helps scientists and government plans for conservation strategies, right? And conservation need, why conservation is important. So the important points, which are, which prevents the species extinction and which maintains ecosystem stability, which protects the natural resources, and which preserves the genetic diversity, so which ensures sustainable development. Okay, so these are the key points for conservation, and conservation is essential for future generation. Okay, conservation is not only for wildlife protection, it is essential for human survival and future generation. So summary of this lecture, so we discussed about biodiversity hotspots, which contains rich and threatens to the biodiversity. So India has major four biodiversity hotspots, and we discussed about habitat loss, which is the greatest threat to the biodiversity, climate change, and poaching, which accelerates the biodiversity decline, and endangered and endemic species, which requires protection. So conservation is required for ecological balance, right? So these are the key points which is discussed in the presentation. Thank you.